Hi, my name's Phil Craig. I'm a writer, a TV producer, a lover of stories, and a connoisseur of scandal. And I'm on a mission to bring you the most scandalous tales ever told. So thanks for joining me here at the Scandal Mongers podcast. Hello and welcome to the first of my new weekly solo shows. I'm very excited. I hope you are too. And not only that, look at this. I have a new toy from producer Theo. Isn't it beautiful? It glows as well. Here we go. New microphone. I want to do this. Now I'm back. How cool is that? I love it. So yeah, thank you for staying with me. Those of you who have. I've been doing lots of planning for future shows. I've got lots of things to talk to you about, which I think I will at the end of this episode. In the meantime, well, what a week. I was on Shauna's program again. If you don't know, you should. Shauna Kay, esteemed host, the Vintage Read, my Australian chum. She had me on and we talked about all sorts of things, but especially a very difficult subject, a very complicated subject of, Hannah Barnes's book and the Tavistock Dog Clinic and things we've covered here on Scandal Mongers. But it was really good to talk to Shauna. And, she's such an easy companion. And I think we have a natural kind of rapport. We see the world not exactly the same, which would be boring, but in a kind of similar way. And I think we're also open to each other's arguments, which is one of the things I've always wanted to do with this podcast. Anyway, we got to talking about culinary matters. She'd seen a picture of me that I put up of me and Mrs. Craig in a hotel recently where we shared a full English breakfast, which, if you don't know, is an enormous kind of artery-clogging pile of food. And it often contains something called a black pudding, which is a quiet taste. I will say I've always loved it. Anyway, I described it in such a way that Judy Stevens, who was commenting, said, hearing Phil talk about his black pudding made me laugh and retch at the same time. Yep, my work here is done. Maybe I will not do too many more restaurant reviews. Lots of great reaction to the last program as well, which I really loved reading. It was the most successful I think I did by myself. I think over 5 million of you watched it on YouTube alone, which is really cool. And various people, obviously, I announced at the end of that program that I was going to be doing this by myself. Actually, I've been thinking a bit about this. I might explore the idea of having a guest host now and again. Got lots of mates I've met in the pod. And for certain subjects, it might be fun to have somebody joining me to help host the show. A bit more of a back and forth like I used to have with Andrew. Anyway, I don't know what you think. Let me know. Please keep going. I just found this pod and I'd hate to see it go, said Charlie398. That's very nice of you. Thank you, Charlie. Sue's Fish Scrapbooking. Sue's Fish Scrapbooking. Crazy name. So pleased you're here. You will be continuing with the show. Phil, says Suze. I really enjoy your measured, thoughtful take on all things royal. That gentle, comfortable with nuance approach feels like it's often lacking in this space. And so it's lovely to have your voice here. Well, I couldn't have written it better myself, and I didn't, but that's the sort of thing I'd love to hear. People say, this was the best of all. Mu Perti Butox 7887. Just ignore those comments, Phil, asking for robust and fair debate. I'm here for the posh tittle-tattle and other sundry shenanigans. Well, we love a shenanigan. We love a bit of posh tittle-tattle. And there's going to be more of that later in the show, in fact, with Anne Courcy, who is back. Yes, she's back. Oh, popular demand. People love Anne. Well, I love Anne. A lot of people point out that she's in the latter half of her 90s. I shouldn't give her age. It's not very gallant, is it, or chivalrous? In the latter half of her 90s. Still working. Not really planning a new book, but doing lots of other things, and obviously very keen to talk about her amazing oeuvre. That's the word we should use. We should use a French word if we're talking about Coco Chanel later. Her oeuvre, which is exceptional. And she kind of has cornered the market, I think, in what she herself once called high-class smut, which a phrase we loved so much we put it on one of our mugs. Oh, do please buy a mug. They're great fun. High-class smut. So more of that later. But a couple of other things I wanted just to catch up on, things that we've touched in the podcast that have been in the news. Two feuding brothers getting back together after a long estrangement caused in part by a woman in their lives. No, it's not William and Harry, although there were some hints that there might be a little bit of a warming in that relationship. which is something, as you know, I quite like to see. I know many of you don't want to see it, but I kind of do. But no, I'm not talking about the Royals. I'm talking about Britain's favourite rock and roll feuding brothers, Oasis, who are getting back together. That's been a big story here, as is the argument about dynamic pricing. You sit on a website for 3 hours. By the time you get to buy your ticket, it's triple the price of when you started. I don't know. It's supposed to stop the ticket touts. Anyway, that's a scandal, some people say. Another story. We've talked about the BBC and the Jimmy Savile era and all the other stars who were caught out doing terrible things and using their celebrity to access young people and children and commit awful crimes, very often sexual crimes. And a really amazing story came out about a man called Niven. James Niven, I think he was called. He ran a car company called Niven Cars. Now, when I was at the BBC at the beginning of my career, working in current affairs, a Niven car was like the ultimate perk, especially if you could put it on your program budget. And if you were working late, you could. And sometimes working late meant staying late at the bar. It's kind of work, wasn't it? Networking? I don't know. It was an indulgence. I'm sure license fee payers would have been very cross if they'd found out how we did abuse that system. But a lovely Niven chauffeur car on the way home at the end of a hard day in the edit suite or at the bar was like a real treat. And Niven himself and the people around him, even then, there was something, I would say, slightly sleazy. They used to love stories. I mean, it was a very louche time. I've written an article about this, actually, in The Critic a couple of years ago. There was kind of lots of bad behaviour that was sort of permissible at the time. And some of it was, looking back, quite sinister. You know, bottoms were pinched and people were cornered in lifts. Women, I'm talking almost always, female colleagues, were subjected to attention they didn't like and didn't want, and they didn't feel they could complain. So that was the bad time, the bad side of it. But there was also a kind of tolerance of people having affairs and being caught after parties in lifts. And famously, at the back of Niven cars, I mean, that was a notorious place. There was a prominent female politician, I am not going to name her, who was once caught up in an over-enthusiastic snogging session, as we used to say in Britain, in the back of one of these Niven cars, and somehow managed to leave parts of her underclothing on the seat. This was collected by one of the drivers, put into a little plastic bag, and of course shown to pretty much all the producers at the BBC for a laugh. Oh dear, wasn't funny, was it really? And then it was discreetly couriered home, and nobody was any the wiser. But that was the atmosphere. But now it turns out that this man Niven was hiring people with very dodgy backgrounds and had a very dodgy background himself, and had been involved with all sorts of things with young boys. And so the idea that the BBC kind of like was a place where someone like that felt at home, could circulate, and you have to wonder the access to celebrities, which celebrities were using him to get to children maybe, or was he using them? I don't know. It was, you know, looking back, things that felt permissive and maybe even kind of like fun. I shouldn't use the word fun, but looking back, they seem very different, don't they? They seem so sinister, and a lot of people were hurt by the likes of Niven, and obviously by the likes of the presenters like Savile, who kind of used that sort of atmosphere, that very permissive atmosphere, to go way, way, way too far, and not being called on it. So that was an interesting story. Right, I think it's time to talk to Anne. A little bit of an introduction, I think. Coco Chanel, been a controversial figure for many years, largely because of her, and we'll get into this with Anne, her relationships during the war. France is occupied. She takes a lover who is a Nazi, a prominent Nazi. And some have suggested was willing to help the occupying authorities. Some have suggested she was willing to work as a spy and maybe even a kind of softer diplomat. She had some great connections in Britain, including Churchill himself, who she come to know in the 1930s, when she was like a super celebrity. And so was he. And the suggestion is that she was part of this thing we talked about on the podcast before, this attempt to kind of use upper-class British people to negotiate a soft peace so that Britain would like step back and give Hitler a free hand to deal with the Bolsheviks, brackets, and the Jews. And that's all been suggested. There's never been any definitive proof of that about Coco, I don't think. But it's something that we're going to talk about with Anne. And of course, her whole life, because she was so phenomenally successful and has such a colourful and, in many ways, very difficult life. And then she becomes like the kind of queen of high society and then really invents things that even today we'd regard as being cutting edge well, not cutting edge, but she kind of invents the modern idea of the fashion industry and the perfume industry and the business of beauty. I mean, nobody's ever really done it like that before, which is why her stuff is still so much in demand, whatever she might or might have done in the war. So here we go to the Riviera, to Paris, to Coco Chanel. See you later. And welcome back. And thank you so much for taking the time.
I know I'm going to enjoy it.
Well, I know I am, because this is just got everything. We've talked about high class smut before, but I mean, it doesn't come any higher class or really any smuttier, does it?
Well, I think that's true, yes. I mean, the thing is, Chanel, who we're going to talk about, I think, Chanel was an absolutely amazing woman. And she was not so much self-made as self-invented, really, from the most unpromising start.
Yeah, let's talk about her start, because it really is a rags to riches story. And maybe the reason she becomes so kind of tough-minded, maybe even selfish later in life, lies in her childhood.
I think it entirely does. I mean, she was illegitimate to start with, although, of course, in childhood that wouldn't have mattered to her very much. But the awful thing was that when she was only about 10 or 11, her mother died. The father was absent pretty well the whole time, and he was rather abusive when he was there. But when her mother died, her sort of world was completely broken up. Her father immediately plonked her in an orphanage and disappeared. She never saw him again.
Wow.
And she was stuck in this orphanage for 8 years. She wasn't mistreated there, but it was what you absolutely think of an institution as being rigid rules. It was a convent. The girls wore black skirts, white blouses. It was miles away from everywhere. There were lessons 6 days out of 7, stone staircases. It was very clean, of course. I mean, they learned what they learned was how to sew, and that really was her gateway to escape.
And she kind of built her life, her public life, I suppose, through a series of, is it fair to say, strategic relationships, or is that unfair?
It was, the first one, I would say, was definitely strategic. The second one, she was deeply in love. The first one, when they were 18, these girls left the convent, and having been taught to sew, they were practically always apprenticed to tailors. She was apprenticed to a tailor with her aunt, who was only actually 2 years older than her. And these two pretty girls went and worked in this tailor's department. And there were several military camps, military cantonments nearby, soldiers. And the young officers used to bring in their uniforms to be altered or however, let's sewn on or anything. And almost needless to say, when they spotted those two pretty girls, they would meet them, take them out. She went to live with one of these officers, but as his second string mistress. He was keeping a notorious cocotte, I mean. And so Chanel spent a lot of her time in the stables where she learnt to ride. She became an expert horsewoman, and she met his other friends, and she fell deeply in love with one of them, with whom she went to live in Paris. And
what was his name?
He was called Boy Capel. And he was actually English, but he had been brought up in France. And, to all intents and purposes, he seemed French. And he was very unusual for that time, because he very much believed that women were not just playthings or playmates. They could actually do things and succeed. And he encouraged her when she started. She started by being a milliner. She made hats that were quite different from the huge Edwardian concoctions that people had before, covered with flowers and feathers and occasionally jewels. She made very simple ones, and people got very attracted by this idea. So she was quite successful as a milliner. She set up as a milliner.
Are we talking about what, the 1910s, First World War, this kind of time now?
It was, yes, around then, yes. And it was in the First World War that she actually started making some of her marvellous clothes from materials that nobody had ever thought of before, like cotton jersey. And of course, they were a different style of clothes from anything that had gone before. She did away with all the constriction. She said, you have to be able to move. And that was behind practically all her clothes. They were fluid. You could move in them. They were pared back. They were elegant. And they were above all simple.
And so how did her life develop? Because certainly by the time that we're going to talk mostly about, the Second World War, she is already in her 50s and incredibly famous and successful.
Yeah.
But how does she build to that in the 20s and 30s? And I guess also, how does her politics become rather, shall we say, dark?
It didn't become dark at all. When we get on to the Second World War, I'll talk about that. But she built herself first. She made costume jewelry, which people hadn't had before. You had a string of royal pearls or a diamond brooch, and that was that. And one of her lovers, a Grand Duke, it was a very brief affair, but they became great friends, gave her he was the grandson of the Tsar, and he escaped the revolution because he tried to kill Rasputin and had been exiled, and that's how he survived.
How did she get into this world? So you say it like it's so normal. Well, she had this affair with this Grand Duke who tried to kill Rasputin and was connected to the Tsar. I mean, it's not a normal kind of world for a hat maker to enter, is it?
Yeah, but by this time she'd started making clothes, and people were so taken with them. And she became friends with a lot of her clients, you see, which was very unusual for somebody who'd been a kept woman. And they entertained her. And she met him. I'm trying to say, she met him at a dinner party. That was it. And so she became quite well off through her clothes, not extravagantly rich. But what really brought her success was her scents, Chanel No. 5. Until then, women had usually worn sort of flowery scents, the kind of sexy, sensual, musky scents had been left to the courtesans. And she thought people were moving in more liberated times. This was the early 20s. And she wanted to create a scent that her clients could use that would be strictly Chanel, you see. So the Grand Duke, in fact, introduced her to a famous, what they call nose, a perfumer, who made up some scents. She told him what she wanted. And he made up, I think, 10 or 12, these little vials, and gave them to her to sniff. And when she got to No. 5, she said, c'est ça. And they had Chanel No. 5.
I never knew that. That is so interesting.
5 was her lucky number. And it was quite a different scent. She gave some to her clients who loved it. And occasionally people would smell one of these expensive women walking past them in a restaurant. Wonder what that is. And then but of course, there wasn't much distribution. And what really made her fortune was the fact that through the head, I think, of Galeries Lafayette, she was introduced to the Wertheimer brothers. And they were owned the biggest cosmetic and perfume company in France. And they said, we'll distribute it. And a deal was struck that the man who'd fixed up the deal, the head of Galeries Lafayette, I think, he got 20%. And the Wertheimers got 70%. And she only got 10%. Well, she signed that. She was very pleased at first at the idea of having it distributed. But the fact that she got so much less than everybody else rankled for years and eventually caused tremendous friction. But they distributed it everywhere, and it became a sort of top seller in America. Everybody had heard of Chanel No. 5. They still have, actually. But that's what made her really rich. And that's when she started moving in, much richer, wealthier, more social circles. And she met all these people, including the Duke of Westminster, with whom she had a long drawn-out affair.
And also the Duke of Windsor, I think.
Well, she met him, but there was
no affair, no.
Absolutely not. No.
Wallace would never have allowed it.
And Chanel wouldn't have wanted it.
No.
I mean, they everybody came to the Riviera at that time. You see, it was, film stars, Chaplin, Garbo, Dietrich, all these people were there. Um, and it was Somerset Maugham lived there, entertained a lot.
And so she divides her time between Paris and then the Riviera in the summer.
Yes, the
Where
Riviera.
she becomes the queen of the Riviera.
She does, rather. It was a house called La Pausa, and she absolutely adored it. It was absolutely hers. It was her sort of refuge, everything like that. She loved it. And of course, she came from the south, from near Auvergne, so she loved sunshine. And she set the fashion for suntan when she came back one year from a cruise with the Duke of Westminster. As she said, brown as a cabin boy. Always before, people had kept out of the sun, must have a lily white complexion. It's not smart to be brown like a peasant. And she made it fashionable.
That's amazing. So we're still living in so many ways with the consequences of her life, her decisions, her interests. Yes. Gosh.
We all know, you probably know plenty of women who have these stripy Breton tops, stripy T-shirt. Which are very popular today. She was the person who spotted them on Breton fishermen and thought, that would be nice. She was very good at spotting things. And people still wear these. And when the Duke of Westminster, she was out, I think, shooting or something with him, and she got a bit cold. And he lent her his jacket, and she thought, why don't we wear tweed? And got some much finer, softer tweed made up. Women hadn't worn tweed suits like that. They'd only worn them in the country, or if they were going accompanying the guns. But they'd never worn them for a sort of smart lunch in Paris. And that's what started the little tweed suits that she made. She was very good at spotting things.
So what was her lifestyle like in the Riviera? Was it very grand? You mentioned, high society figures, movie stars. Did they have wild parties, or was it all much more kind of restrained? How did they live?
I wouldn't call it restrained. After all, I think Somerset Maugham it was who said that it was a sunny place for shady people. But it was, what they had was there were lots of house parties. If you had a villa there, like Maxine Elliot, you asked a house party of 10 or 20 to stay, and you probably had a lunch party every day. It was incredibly social. People would go there. A lot of people would move on to Venice. The Mosleys went there every year. Churchill went there a lot. He used to stay with Maxine Elliot. He went there. He would paint a lot. Lloyd George went there. Lloyd George managed to have both his wife and, after she left, his mistress to stay with him out there. The casino at Monte Carlo was a huge attraction. People used to gamble there. You'd see everybody there.
And were there drugs involved in this circle, or? I've certainly seen it. I've read somewhere that she was quite fond of bowls of cocaine, but that might just be a modern.
I don't think bowls of cocaine. No, what people sometimes did. Her best friend became rather morphine. Her best friend and sort of best friend who was almost a rival, Misha Sert, became hooked on morphine. Chanel would, yes, from time to time, Chanel would, but she was, I wouldn't describe her as a drug addict at all. She couldn't have done what she did. And the bowls of cocaine were much more Goering's style. It was morphine mostly, if people took anything. Quite a few people in England did. Lady Diana Cooper, who took drugs at that time, or a bit earlier. They were sort of really more recreational. And Jean Cocteau, the playwright and all-round sort of polymath, who was a great friend of Chanel's, he definitely was one. And she several times paid for him to go into rehab and, supported him in that way, and was very strict about him not.
Okay, well, everybody knows, I'm sure most people listening to this know, that during the Second World War, she does have this relationship with this German lover, yes, and consequently was very, quite heavily criticized for collaborating with, perhaps even supporting some of the policies of the Nazi occupation. Did you feel that there were any, well, A, do you think that's a fair criticism? And B, were there any signs of that? I think the Duke of Westminster, who had been one of her lovers, you mentioned, was quite anti-Semitic in the pre-war years. I mean, how do you explain that part of her life?
She was anti-Semitic in that she would rant against Jews. On the other hand, she had some Jewish friends and she had a Jewish doctor she adored. It was much more yakety yakety yak than actually doing anything about it. And she and the German lover, I forget for the moment which was it, tried to save one of the Jewish writers.
Oh.
Which is perhaps not so generally known.
Because I think a lot of French Jews do sort of flee to the Riviera, don't they, when the Germans move in?
An awful lot fled to the Riviera. Certainly, I mean, partly from when the Netherlands were invaded, but certainly once the Germans occupied France, they fled to unoccupied France, and they fled to the Riviera, where the French turned against them terribly. The French were absolutely ghastly to a lot of them, including veterans who'd fought for France in the First World War, and perhaps lost an arm or a leg or something. Their behaviour was appalling.
So I think the man we're talking about that was Hans Gunther von Dinklage.
That's right,
the German. And
yes.
again, you get into all this kind of cloak and dagger stuff. He was apparently, you could say, a diplomat, or you could say a spy. And there were suggestions he was involved with trying to do peace deals with the British through this kind of aristocratic circle of Nazi sympathizers. I mean, there are so many legends about Chanel. Is this something you give any credence to?
She got involved. During the war, Chanel really was all about survival. She adored France, and she also adored Britain. But above all, she wanted her, Chanel, to survive. And yes, she took this German lover, who, as she was at pains to point out to anybody who would listen, was half English. He lived in France for a long time before the war. I mean, he spoke perfect French and perfect English. And he was a spy. He was obviously a very bad spy, because when he was sent to spy in Switzerland, they all realized at once that he was a spy, and all his letters to his wife, they were all monitored. And when he went down to the south of France, to the village where his wife was living, everybody there knew he was a spy. But they said, we aren't going to do anything about it, because if we get rid of him, we might get a real one that we don't know about. Whereas him, we just know about. And so I would say that, yes, of course he was a Nazi, because, well, you couldn't really get on if you went. But he wasn't a sort of ferocious one like all the top ones. And I think, like Chanel, he just wanted to live a kind of luxurious, peaceful life. And of course, you mustn't forget, she was an absolute trophy to have. She was the most famous woman in France. So it was and during the war, they led a very comfortable life, but they didn't go to the smart restaurants. I mean, there were a lot of French women who were upper-class French women who German officers would escort to places like Maxim's and would dine out a lot. There was nothing like that. They usually ate quietly at home, or they had Cocteau and his lover round to dinner, or they would go and see Misha. But it was a tiny circle. But she did her best to lead a life that was comfortable, and she wanted all that, partly because she had shut her couture house at the beginning of the war, unlike the other couture houses that sold to the Germans.
But it was about survival. She wasn't necessarily that enthusiastic about the Germans. She wanted to get through the war. She wanted to keep her company going and herself going.
Yes, she was not enthusiastic about the Germans at all. But on the other hand, there they were. I mean, when she heard France had surrendered, there'd been a great exodus from Paris when the Germans got close enough to shell it. A huge flood of people. And she had gone down to, I think, her where her former lover lived in the south in the Auvergne. And when she heard France had surrendered, as it did after only 6 weeks of fighting, she locked herself in her room and was in floods. I mean, she adored France. It was part of her. And she loved England she lived in England a lot with the Duke of Westminster. And there she met Winston Churchill. She became a close friend of Winston Churchill.
Before the war. Before the war, we're talking.
Yes, yes. Before the war. And before the war, every time he came to Paris, he would come and see Chanel. There's an account in, I think, Cocteau's diary that this was in about, I suppose, beginning of 1937. She's asked Cocteau to dinner because Winston is coming to dinner with his son Randolph. And Winston, the abdication had just taken place, and Winston Churchill sobbed on her shoulder. He was so upset about the abdication.
What a great story, goodness. So we talk about this wonderful, colourful high society world in the Riviera. Now, of course, America is not in the war for quite a while. Do all these movie stars still come over for the summer in 1941, even though it's kind of like Vichy now? Or is that it? Is that kind of glamour just gone?
Well, the glamour didn't go for a long time. In fact, a lot of people, they stuck there as long as they could till finally they were told, look, you must get out, you must get out. And even then, some of them wouldn't. I mean, there were 2 coal tankers. I think they were coal tankers that were hired to take most of the British away. And there's a graphic account by Somerset Maugham of leaving on these. I mean, they were filthy dirty. And, but for instance, one of the people who lived in the Riviera, Lord Furness, who was married to a great beauty, Lady Furness, I think she was the 2nd or 3rd Lady Furness. She was an Australian and dazzling. All conversation in the casino stopped when she came in because everybody stared. And she brought him to the ship, and he said it was so filthy he wasn't getting onto it. So she was stuck there for the war. And she used to secretly feed prisoners in camp. There was an internment camp very nearby. She and her daughter would dress as peasants and pedal off with stuff in their bicycles so they could push through the bars to these prisoners, but getting thinner and thinner and thinner. I mean, there was great privation on the Riviera, even in the Second World War, after France had surrendered, because even though it was supposed to be unoccupied, the Germans were exported all the food to Germany. I mean, the peasants used to cut the leaves off their potatoes. Otherwise, Germans would see that they were potato plants, dig the potatoes up and send them to Germany. And they made the fishermen, they would take most of the catch from the fishermen, and off that would go to Germany. So unless you were in the black market, which a lot of people who could afford it were, but most weren't, you just got thinner and thinner.
And one of the reviews of your book on Amazon, it's got some very good reviews, by the way, and it's an absolutely brilliant read, as I guess anybody can probably guess from listening to this conversation. But one of them said, this is an unusually sympathetic account of Chanel's life and made me like her a bit more. Did writing it make you like her a bit more?
Yes, because you see, I'd heard what everybody said before, she was pro-Nazi and all the rest of it. And from all my research, it seemed to me that she just wasn't. She felt very close to Churchill. There was an abortive attempt to bring about a peace meeting because through von Dinklage, there were quite a lot of Germans who realized, God, what have we got into? And just how fanatical and frightful Hitler was. Because not everybody was a convinced Nazi. But it was a case of, in a dictatorship, you have to go along if you don't want unpleasant consequences. I'm sure today an awful lot of Russians don't like that war, but they can't say so.
Of course, after the wars, as many people will know, there's all sorts of famous kind of distressing imagery of collaborators, as they were called, often women, who had had
Yes,
affairs with or children by German soldiers or German
yes,
diplomats. They're being marched through the streets. They're being spat upon. They're having their heads shaved. Did
yes.
Chanel fear that might happen to her?
I don't think she did. She was an incredibly courageous person. And you see, people turned on women partly because they were much weaker, much easier to turn on. But I often think people talk about collaboration, but I often think if I had been a French woman in the war with 3 children, say, and we were all starving, and a German soldier said, "If you're nice to me, I will see that you and your children are fed," well, how would I have reacted? Everybody in France thought Germany was going to win the war, you see. Nobody thought Britain could stand alone. At the beginning, certainly nobody guessed that America would come in, but people really didn't. People really thought Germany was going to win in
Well,
France.
and of course, a lot of people have said that the French state after the war didn't want to get into this stuff because really the resistance didn't take off for quite a few years in any meaningful way. And most people just did what Chanel did. They tried to make the best of it. And some of them were more enthusiastic, informing on their neighbors, saying that there are Jews hiding in that barn. There was a lot of
Yes,
that.
yes, yes, there was a lot of that. They were terrible. The French have always been very anti-Semitic. I mean, you've only got to think of the Dreyfus case. We had a Jewish prime minister. They had the Dreyfus case. It,
But you don't think Coco Chanel was in that camp at all. She's a special category, a survivor, a pragmatist. That's how you kind of feel.
yeah, I feel she was a pragmatist, a survivor. Yes, she would be. She would give anti-Semitic rants. There's another entry in Cocteau's diary of how embarrassed he was when she gave an anti-Semitic rant at a dinner party with Kitty Rothschild sitting close by. She sort of somehow didn't connect what she thought of Jewish people as those she knew. They somehow, as I say, she had plenty of Jewish friends. But yes, I mean, if you'd asked her, I'm sure she would have said she was anti Semitic.
But I guess, the circles in which she moved, excluding the Rothschilds, but certainly the circles in which the Duke of Windsor moved, those kind of opinions were very commonplace, and they were not perhaps seen. It was just, I don't know, something that you grew up
Yes,
understanding that there were these people, and we were friends with them, but actually they're different to us, and sometimes we don't really like them.
yes, I would say you've summed that up very accurately. Yes, there was a kind of low level uh, uh, line, but I mean, she would never have, I don't think she would have ever turned a Jewish person in. And don't forget, during the war, the architect who built her house, her villa, La Pausa, um, in the cellars, he installed a wireless radio receiver. And so it was a sort of slight hub for the resistance. He was in the resistance. And whether she knew it was there or not, I wasn't able to discover. She may well have known it was there and just thought I'm turning a blind eye. But that was from her house, the resistance was being helped.
Oh, interesting. So after the war, I mean, the company does survive, and it seems to go to even greater heights. I mean, how does she spend the
Well,
last few decades of her life, and does she build on the success or just kind of shore it up?
she she left France sort of almost immediately after the war and settled with von Dinklage in Switzerland for about 7 years. And then the Wertheimers, the ones who bought Chanel and who she tried to prosecute and tried to get more money, eventually Pierre Wertheimer, who was actually a great fan of Chanel's, even after what she'd done.
These are the people that are getting half the profits.
70%.
70%,
Yes,
sorry, yeah.
yes, which is quite a lot. They came to a deal. They gave her more profits. And he said, "You've got to start your collection again." And she said, "Oh, I can't. I'm too old," or something. He said, "Rubbish." And I think she was 70 when she restarted it. And the first year, she got an absolute panning from the press. She introduced the little tweed suit that we all know about. The next year, the suit was selling out. Her clothes were selling out to everyone. So she relaunched herself at that age in, I think it was 53 or 54, and had a tremendously successful last year's. And she had beautiful things. She got very good taste. Her apartments were always lovely. She had coromandel screens, beautiful furniture. Um, Houses were done up beautifully. She loved a simple, neutral palette, which she applied to decoration as well. And so she lived in great, elegant but simple style.
It's interesting, though, given the picture you paint of her childhood and how austere it was, stone steps, black clothes, that the reaction to that is to make this very different world, which we're still living in, I guess. Ideas of beauty and grace and refinement.
Yes.
Still.
I think it affected her from the point of view of simplicity. She saw that, in these stone steps, this building set against the green fields in the forest, in simplicity, there was beauty. She always talked about how to be truly elegant, you had to have simplicity. I mean, she was very keen on that. She didn't like too much, although she had masses of costume jewelry. The basic clothes, the basic garments were fairly simple. They were just beautifully cut.
Well, thank you so much. This is such an amazing world that you bring to life in this book, actually, and in all your books. But it's very colourful and it's very sympathetic and very kind of fair-minded, your account, because I think there have been some other books that have taken a much more aggressive position on her. And I'm sure you were aware of them when you did yours, and perhaps you were reacting to them.
Yes, indeed. But I think some of them were a bit unfair, because the other thing, and this is looking at it just really, I suppose, logically rather than evidence. I mean, there's very little useful information she could have transmitted to the Germans. She could have told them who was having a love affair with who in the ballet, because she moved very much in the arts world. But she had absolutely no military or political connections at all. And so what could she have told them? What was the latest fashion for dessert? Or anything about the arts world, but she couldn't have given them valuable strategic, tactical information at all, I don't think. And so she would have been pretty useless as a spy.
Well, as you say, maybe not a spy, but certainly a survivor. And
yes.
Thank you so much. And quite a few people have in our comments, I don't know if you ever look at them, have said, please persuade Anne to write another book. But I think last time you spoke to us, you said maybe you wouldn't.
Well, I have got an eye problem. That's the thing, which is making it rather difficult. But
well, I'm sorry to hear that. Thanks so much for your book and for this conversation. And it's been a pleasure to talk to you again.
And it has for me, Phil, too.
Oh, all the best, Anne. Bye.
Yes, bye.
Well, here I am with my glowing microphone. Quite a conversation, actually. Really interesting. Really interesting. Always good to talk to Anne. And she's very open to difficult questions about her work. And I'm not quite sure what I think, to be honest, about this. I suspect with Coco, if the war had ended differently, she'd have found it quite easy to live in a Nazi-dominated Europe, whatever was terrible things were happening to the minorities that Hitler hated. That said, she had to survive, I suppose. There's some evidence that she did try and do some positive things for her friends, especially her Jewish friends who were in trouble, but there's also obviously quite a lot of evidence that she shared, well, the prejudices of her time and her class. Well, no, not her class. She was born in quite a poor background, as we know. Perhaps the prejudices that she came to acquire as she moved into high society. Certainly people like the Duke of Westminster were notorious anti-Semites and openly would talk about their hatred for people of that background and faith and ethnicity. And of course, that fueled so many of the suggestions that there were people in Britain. It wasn't just that, part of that anti-Bolshevism is part of it too. But there was a suggestion, which we talked about a couple of months ago with the famous Rudolf Hess mission, that there was a group of people in high society, and they would have had friends in France like Coco Chanel who would have been happy to make a deal because they didn't really think Britain was fighting on the right side. And they had some sympathy for what Hitler was doing, even the really revolting things. I think we have to face that. But that said, it's a really interesting discussion to have. I would never question Anne's motives in any of this. I mean, she knows more about Coco Chanel than I ever will. And this is her view, having read and spoken to a lot of people and read lots of sources, that she's just a bit, maybe a bit more forgiving than perhaps some of us would be. Still, I hope you agree. A really interesting conversation, and not the last we'll have with Anne, because she's got so many other books that she'd love to talk about, and I'd love to talk to her about. Looking forward, well, I've been setting up some really cool stuff. I talked to Giles Milton the other day about another subject, really about the Second World War, touching on the Second World War, a book he's written about Stalin and Churchill and Roosevelt, and the kind of personal dramas and soap operas that were going on behind the scenes that kept that key relationship going. To give you a sense of what it's like, its working title was Vodka with Stalin, and there's a lot of vodka in it. Also some really colourful characters. It's a great conversation. Lots of other things to look forward to as well. Talking over the next few weeks to Simon Heffer about the abdication crisis. Nick Bryant, who is the BBC correspondent, was until recently in America, about his book and his views about his time in America. He wrote a book called The Forever War, which I think our American audience might, well, some of you will like and some of you will hate. But it's a very interesting book, and he's an interesting person to talk to. Also thinking about doing slightly more unusual subjects. I'm talking to an academic I hope will come on, but I shouldn't name her yet, to writing about the Gothic imagination, the kind of scandalous world of Lord Byron and the people around him, and the kind of milieu that produced the kind of classic Dracula stories, Frankenstein stories. I think that could be really interesting. A completely new world, a bit like when we did the Crusaders or the Roman women. I think I might do more of those kind of shows because they really interest me, and you get to meet some really cool people. So lots to look forward to. As ever, hope you can keep subscribing. I'm moving towards 10,000. I am told wonderful things happen at 10,000. So if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. Get your friends to do it. Help me out. Really appreciate it. All the likes are also appreciated, and the comments and the engagement. I'm in this for the long haul, it seems, and I'm looking forward to it. And thank you so much for coming with me on this little scandalous journey. All the best. Bye. This has been a Podcast World production. If you want to contact me, write to team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandalmongers in the heading, or you can reach out via the social media links in the show's bio. And if you've enjoyed this episode and you want to support the show, please consider taking a few seconds to hit the donate button found just below this video. Many thanks, and see you next week.